Back to the future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
He built a machine no one believed could work. Then he stepped inside it and vanished without a trace. For 29 years, the world assumed he was dead, delusional, or a fraud. Then suddenly, 29 years later, he reappeared, looking barely older than the day he disappeared. And in his hands was something impossible, concrete evidence that time may not flow exactly the way we believe. But where did he go? And what did he witness during the 29 years he was gone? The crazy caller from Missouri. In the mid-1990s, anyone drawn to the unexplained knew one name: Coast to Coast. AM, created and hosted by Art Bell, the show broadcast from a trailer in the Nevada desert to over 500 stations across North America, pulling in as many as 15 million listeners on its strongest nights. Bell had a gift for taking his callers seriously without endorsing them. When someone said something extraordinary on Coast to Coast AM, the audience did not laugh. They leaned in. One such call came in January 1995 from a young man who identified himself only as Mike from Missouri.
To time travel. Something that would save you, your friends, your neighbors, your family. And you go back 50 years per se, 80 years, and you had a choice of killing all those people to save yourselves and your friends.
He was 21, an electrical science student, and he had not called to share a ghost story. He had called to report that he had built something. His device was a modified Jacob's ladder, a high-voltage demonstration in which an electric arc climbs between two diverging metal rods. He had paired it with a laser salvage from a CD player, using the beam to stabilize the heated air column into a persistent rotating vortex of electromagnetic energy. His first test had involved a metal screw tossed into the vortex at close range. For a fraction of a second, it disappeared entirely, then reappeared slightly displaced from where it had entered. He believed, with complete conviction, that the screw had moved through time. Art Bell went quiet. Then he asked Markham to explain it again, slowly, from the beginning. The device sounded almost insultingly simple: 2 metal rods, a CD laser, and a car battery, yet the phenomenon Markham described did not fit anything in the standard physics curriculum. That tension between the ordinary and the impossible was exactly what made him impossible to ignore. 15 million people were awake at 3 in the morning by choice, tuned to a show that took the impossible seriously. The real question was not whether it was plausible. It was whether Markham was describing something real that science had not yet caught up to. And more pressingly, how far did he intend to go? The answer, as it turned out, was much further than anyone around him was prepared for. Time Machine Man. Following the broadcast, Coast to Coast, AM invited Markham back as a featured studio guest, and he arrived with more than a story. He arrived with a plan. His Jacob's Ladder prototype had proven the concept at a small scale, but scaling the vortex to a size large enough for a human being required power on an entirely different level. A standard classroom demonstration runs on a few hundred watts. Markham's first device was pulling 20,000 volts through a modified step-up transformer he had built himself. Already an extraordinary piece of work for a 21-year-old with no formal engineering training. But the vortex he was generating was too small. A screw could pass through it. He needed something large enough for a person. Scaling up to that required industrial-level power, the kind that runs entire city blocks. And Mike Markham, sitting in a rented house in Stanberry, Missouri, did not have access to that. So he went and took it. On January 29, 1995, Gentry County Sheriff Eugene Lupfer arrested Markham at his residence with a warrant for the theft of 6 power transformers from St. Joseph Light and Power's Generating Station in King City, Missouri. The transformers were not small. Each one weighed hundreds of pounds. Getting them out of a secured utility facility and into a residential garage required planning, physical effort, and a level of commitment that most people reserve for legitimate careers. Markham's neighbor later told reporters that when Markham turned the device on with those transformers connected, the houses for blocks around would simply go dim, as if the whole neighborhood were holding its breath. In Markham's back bedroom, officers found 4 transformers of varying sizes. On the back porch, a 5th was connected directly to the electrical fuse box. Lines ran from there to something that, according to the police report, resembled a TV antenna. However, anyone who understood what they were looking at would have recognized it as something far more ambitious. For the theft, he was sentenced to 60 days in jail and 5 years of probation, charged with grand theft, not with the time travel experiments themselves. Local papers gave him the nickname Time Machine Man, intending it as mockery. Markham treated it as a title. The confession, broadcast to millions on his return appearance, should have destroyed his credibility. Instead, it made him more famous. The response from listeners was staggering. Letters arrived at the station in waves. On one side were trained physicists and electrical engineers, writing with the kind of calm urgency that comes from people who genuinely believe someone is about to hurt themselves. They warned Markham about feedback loops, about uncontrolled plasma behavior, about the catastrophic potential of high-voltage electromagnetic fields at residential scale. On the other side were believers, people who sent money, spare components, encouragement, and in some cases, their own half-finished experiments. Anonymous donations arrived, often with simple notes like, "Keep going and don't let them stop you." Markham took the donations, moved to Overland Park, Kansas, and started over. This time, he promised, legally. By 1996, he declared he was just 30 days from completing a working prototype. He said he intended to be the first human test subject. He said he would take only a phone. The audience had been waiting for this moment, and what came next was not the breakthrough they expected, but something far more unsettling. Death by obsession. When Markham returned to Coast AM in late 1996, listeners who remembered his earlier appearances heard a man who had changed. The excitement was still there, but underneath it was something frantic. A quality in the voice that suggested he had spent too long alone with something he could not fully control. He spoke rapidly, circling the same points, insisting he was almost there, that he just needed more power and a cleaner energy field. This appearance also came with a troubling inventory of side effects. Objects placed near the vortex had begun stuttering between existence and non-existence, flickering as though caught between 2 versions of the same moment. Animals he had tested showed neurological disruption after exposure, moving with the disorientation of creatures unable to reconcile what their senses were telling them. He had run over 200 objects and animals through the device in total. To Markham, none of this was alarming. He described it with complete calm as proof of progress. A follow-up call was scheduled for March 1997. The audience circled the date, but when the time came, Markham did not call. Attempts to reach him at his listed number went unanswered. Letters came back unopened. People who had met him during his time in Kansas could not locate him. His family offered no information about his whereabouts. The Missouri State Highway Patrol received no missing persons report, a detail that would later fuel its own layer of speculation. Was it negligence, or was it silence by design? Shortly after his disappearance, a fire broke out at his home. Firefighters traced it to a massive electrical overload in the garage. The blaze consumed the workshop entirely. What the investigators found in the ruins was notable not for what it contained, but for what it did not. There was no body. There were melted copper wires, a twisted metal frame where the Jacob's ladder had stood, fused at the tips as though the arc had never stopped, and a single handwritten note, partially burned but legible, that read, "It's not about time, it's about perspective." 7 words, no further explanation. The theories began immediately. The absence of a body was the detail that refused to settle. In almost every other story of an experimenter killed by their own device, the aftermath was unambiguous: wreckage, evidence, a conclusion. What Markham left behind was a set of conditions that could be read in opposite directions depending on what you already believed. For skeptics, a man had run a dangerous, unsupervised high-voltage experiment and paid the price. For believers, a man had done exactly what he said he would do, and the fire was the proof of it. Both readings were consistent with the physical evidence. Neither could be ruled out, and that ambiguity was not going to stay quiet for long. The deep state secret. What fills a vacuum is always more interesting than whatever caused it. In Mike Markham's case, the vacuum lasted nearly 2 decades, and what filled it was one of the most elaborate bodies of amateur paranormal theorizing in American internet history. According to some fans, the fire was not an accident, but the explosive result of his final, successful experiment. The reasoning followed a logic that was difficult to argue against cleanly. If Markham had failed, there would be a body. If there were nobody, he would have gone somewhere. Where he had gone was debated across paranormal forums for years, with theories ranging from the future, where his work would finally be understood, to the past, where he might have been trying to correct something he had seen go wrong. The debate shifted dramatically when forum users began connecting his disappearance to a much older case. They uncovered a 1930s report of an unidentified body washed ashore on a California beach, found crushed inside a metal tube with a rectangular device in his possession that bore an unsettling resemblance to a modern mobile phone. The implication was immediately obvious. Markham had attempted to travel to the past, lost control of his destination, and died on a California beach decades before he was born. No photograph of the body was ever produced. The report was never independently verified. Yet the theory spread as fact for years, partly because it was so vivid and partly because no one had a better explanation. The government cover-up theory arrived next. This reading held that Markham's experiments had advanced far enough to attract classified attention, and that a government agency had staged the fire, seized all documentation, and removed Markham from public life to keep the technology under control. Proponents pointed to the Philadelphia experiment of 1943 as precedent, arguing that the U.S. military's interest in electromagnetic manipulation of space was well established and had simply never stopped. Then, in 2006, a man signing himself Markham Markham sent a cryptic email to a college professor in Oregon who had written about DIY electrical coils. The email contained hand-drawn sketches of a device labeled Vortex Stabilization Frame Gen 3. The IP address was traced to a public library in Kauai, Hawaii. No follow-up contact was ever made. The sketches were never explained. The sender was never identified. By the time social media arrived, Markham was already a legend. YouTube videos racked up millions of views. Reddit threads debated his fate, with discussions running to thousands of comments. He had become what very few real people ever become, a myth with a pulse. And then another Art Bell revelation changed everything again. The Second Coming. In 2015, 18 years after the fire, a voice that many had assumed was gone forever came back on air. Markham appeared on Midnight in the Desert, the radio show hosted by Art Bell's successor, Heather Wade, and spoke for the first time about what had actually happened in that garage. He was older, he was guarded, and he carried a warning. He described the night of March 1997 in detail. The third-generation machine had produced a stable electromagnetic field, more stable than anything he had managed before. Confident it was ready, he stepped fully into the active ring. What followed was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no rushing sensation, no cinematic transit through time. There was only a quiet, unsettling dislocation, as if the world had shifted while he stayed fixed. When he stepped out, the surroundings looked unchanged, but hours had passed, and the machine had overheated, igniting the garage behind him. He escaped the fire, but something had changed, and not in the way he expected. When he tried to reconnect with ordinary life, he found that people who knew him could not quite hold on to him. Friends recognized his face, but forgot his name seconds later. His presence had not vanished, but it had become strangely difficult for others to register or retain. He did not explain what this meant. He said only that his relationship to reality had been altered, that he was present in the world, but no longer fully synchronized with it, like a radio tuned slightly off frequency. He spent years drifting, unable to establish anything permanent, before he began to understand what had happened well enough to document it. By 2021, he had assembled what he called a complete record of the device, its design, its failures, and its consequences. He needed somewhere safe to store it and chose a farmhouse in rural Ohio. He knew the address. He knew the magnetic field stability was optimal for long-term storage. He sealed everything in a wooden box, hid it behind a wall in the attic, and left. In October 2022, Andrew and Melanie Carter, a couple in their early 30s who had recently purchased that same farmhouse, began renovating. While removing attic insulation, Melanie hit something solid behind a wall. It was a heavy wooden box, crusted with grime, bearing a faded handwritten label. M. Markham, do not open until the right time. Inside lay several journals filled with dense notes, circuit diagrams, and dated entries spanning 1995 to 2021. Alongside them were electronic components, some circuit boards burned and warped, others pristine in anti-static bags. On top rested a Polaroid of a man standing beside a large ring-shaped metal frame. The date stamp read June 21st, 2021. On the back, in the same handwriting as the box label, it did work, but not the way I thought it would. The Carters shared the discovery on Reddit. Within days, longtime followers of the Markham story reached out. 3 weeks later, Andrew answered a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was worn and exhausted, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with old coast-to-coast recordings. "This is Mike Markham," it said. "I hear you found my box. Can I come visit?" He arrived at the farmhouse on a cool October evening. He was 59 years old, exactly as old as he would have been if time had passed normally since 1997. But his face was more weathered than it should have been, hollowed out in the way of someone who had experienced things that left no physical mark but took everything else. Over the course of that visit, he explained what the device had actually done. He had spent 25 years not dead, not displaced in time, but suspended in a kind of permanent adjacency to the life he had been living. And the box in the attic, the journals, the circuit diagrams, the Polaroid, was his attempt to hand something solid to a world that had spent decades deciding what had happened to him, without ever asking. The man who never left his own timeline. According to Debbie Smith, administrator of Paranormal Forum, Markham was living in Hawaii in the late 2010s, homeless on a beach. He launched a GoFundMe in 2016 to fund new research. It raised $10. In February 2022, he posted directly on Paranormal Forum under his own name. "Rumors are ablazing that I am dead," he wrote, "not well, and had time traveled to 1930-something, where I died on a beach in a tube. Whatever was found in the 1930s was not me." By September 2022, a Reddit comment from an account under the name Real Modman Markham confirmed that he had returned to Ohio. He maintains an active Facebook profile posting photographs of electrical equipment, and the Missouri State Highway Patrol still does not list him as a missing person. What separates Markham from the long tradition of time travel hoaxers is the absence of an incentive. He never published a book, never sold merchandise, never charged for interviews. He behaved like someone who had something he could not stop carrying and had given up on expecting anyone to believe it. And it is precisely that quality, the absence of performance, that brings us directly to the question serious physicists have been quietly wrestling with for just as long as Markham has been telling his story. Is time travel real? The man from a mythical country. In July 1954, customs officials at Haneda Airport in Tokyo stopped a well-dressed European traveler whose documents appeared entirely legitimate except for one detail. His passport listed his country of origin as Taured, a nation that did not exist in 1954 and does not exist today. The man expressed his own confusion, explaining calmly that Taured had existed for over 1,000 years between France and Spain. When handed a map, he pointed directly at Andorra, insisting that Taured was supposed to be there, exactly where it had always been. Officials detained him overnight in a guarded hotel room. The hotel he claimed to have booked had no record of his reservation. The company he was scheduled to meet with had never heard of him. The bank printed on his checkbook could not be located in any directory. The following morning, the room was empty. The guards reported the door had never opened. Every one of his personal documents had disappeared from the secure airport office at the same time. The man from Taurid was never seen again, and the case has never been resolved. However, his story would surface decades later in a case that was far less poetic and far more financially audacious. The con artist from the future. On January 29, 2003, the FBI arrested a man named Andrew Carlson on charges of insider trading. In 2 weeks, beginning with $800, he had executed 126 consecutive high-risk stock trades without a single loss, converting his stake into over $350 million. In custody, Carlson reportedly delivered a 4-hour confession, claiming to be a time traveler from 2 centuries in the future. He offered investigators the location of Osama bin Laden and the cure for AIDS in exchange for permission to return to his craft. A third party whose identity was never established paid his bail. Carlson missed his court appearance. Subsequent investigation found no birth records, no educational history, no documentation of any kind suggesting he had existed before the early 2000s. Among his otherwise unverifiable claims, Carlson predicted the exact date of the United States invasion of Iraq, months before the invasion occurred and before any public announcement had been made. The Carlson story is widely attributed to a weekly world news fabrication. No FBI arrest record has been independently verified, but the story circulates with the tenacity of something true, and the Iraq detail has never been satisfactorily explained within the fiction framework. The Hamburg shipyard prediction. In 1932, British journalist J. Bernard Hutton and his photographer Joachim Brandt were assigned to document the Hamburg shipyard. They completed their work and were preparing to leave when the sound of aircraft engines drew their attention upward. Within seconds, the sky was filled with fighter planes, and bombs began falling across the facility in what appeared to be a full-scale coordinated attack. Structures collapsed. Debris spread in every direction. A security guard urged both men to evacuate, and they drove toward Hamburg. When they reached the city, nothing had happened. The streets were quiet. When they looked back, the shipyard stood entirely undamaged on the horizon. Their newspaper rejected the story. The photographs Brandt had taken showed only the shipyard in perfect condition. The incident was filed as the product of stress. Hutton moved to London and did not speak publicly about what he had seen. Then, in 1943, Hutton opened a newspaper and read about a devastating Allied bombing raid on the Hamburg shipyard. The targets matched exactly. The patterns of destruction matched exactly. The sequence of events he and Brandt had witnessed on a clear afternoon 11 years earlier had just played out in the real world, down to the specific structures hit. He had not imagined it. He had seen it early, by more than a decade, with no mechanism that could explain how. This type of experience, sometimes called a time slip, appears in the historical record with enough regularity to have attracted serious academic attention. The Society for Psychical Research has documented dozens of cases. None has been conclusively explained or debunked either. A drive back to the past. In 1969, Louisiana businessman L.C. and his partner Bob were driving along Highway 167 toward Lafayette when they noticed a slow-moving car ahead of them that looked unusually old, a turtleback model from decades earlier. The car appeared immaculate. The license plate read 1940. The woman driving wore a vintage dress and a fur coat, both unmistakably from the 40s. A child sat beside her, bundled against a cold that L.C. and Bob were not feeling. The woman appeared deeply distressed, scanning her surroundings as though she had been deposited somewhere entirely unfamiliar. After repeated signals, she pulled to the side of the road. L.C. and Bob stopped ahead and got out. When they turned around, the car was gone. On a clear, open highway with no side roads, there was nowhere it could have gone. Further down the highway, the sequence repeated. A second car passed a stationary older vehicle that vanished in the same manner. The driver of that second car was equally shaken. The three witnesses compared accounts and searched the area on foot. They found nothing. What made the case compelling to researchers was not its drama, but its structure. Multiple independent witnesses, a consistent description, and no conventional explanation that accounts for a disappearance on an open road. So maybe Mike Markham's case is indeed true, and time travel is real. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.